This winter had arrived late, but when it came, it brought with it a relentless storm. Freya, the German shepherd mother, could feel the bone-chilling cold that had settled over the entire forest. She was no stranger to nature's harshness. But this time, everything seemed to be pushing her to her limits. The wind howled through the bare trees, sending shivers through even the coldest rocks beneath the snow. The world around her felt desolate, blanketed in a thick white layer of snow, as if the entire world had been swallowed up by an unyielding sheet of ice. With no way out, but amid the freezing cold, there was a fire that burned fiercely in Freya's heart. She was no longer just a wild animal, fending for herself. Every step she took, every second, was focused on a single goal: her son. Max, her fragile puppy, could no longer endure the snowstorm. Just days ago, he had been a healthy pup, with a shiny coat and lively eyes. But now, his body was growing weaker by the hour. Each step he took was staggered, his small legs trembling as he struggled to keep up with his mother. Freya could hear his shallow breaths, and the exhaustion in his every move. Max collapsed into a thick blanket of snow, his tiny body barely able to rise. "Max," Freya called softly, then paused immediately. Turning back, she nudged him gently with her nose, urging him to stand, but Max could barely open his eyes, whimpering softly before collapsing again. His weak whimper echoed through Freya's heart, each cry feeling like a knife through her chest. She glanced ahead, through the swirling snow, and saw a faint glimmer in the distance, a possible salvation for Max. This was her only chance. Freya had to push on. She no longer felt the biting cold against her fur. All she could feel was the burning determination inside her to save her son. "There's still time," Freya whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure if it really meant anything anymore. She couldn't give up, couldn't let her son die in her arms. With every ounce of strength, she pushed forward, lifting Max gently in her mouth, dragging him through the deepening snow. Step by painstaking step, Freya knew time was running out. Max was fading fast, and if they didn't make it soon, he wouldn't survive. Her determination was the only thing keeping her going now. She heard Max's labored breathing, his tiny body too weak to keep moving. Her heart broke with each step as she watched him struggle. But she refused to stop. They couldn't give up. The wind grew fiercer, and the snowflakes became so thick that Freya could barely see the path ahead. She stopped once more, glancing down at Max. His little body was limp in her mouth. She lowered her head, softly whining in sorrow. But she knew deep inside that they had to make it. She had to get him to the cabin. The light ahead, faint but unmistakable, became her focus. It was a tiny cabin, nestled in the snow, but to Freya, it represented hope, warmth, and life. She pushed on with everything she had left, her body trembling in the cold as she reached the front door of the cabin. Her legs finally gave out beneath her. She collapsed to the snow, breathing raggedly, but she had made it. Freya laid Max gently on the porch and sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the door, her whole body shaking with exhaustion. She whined softly, a weak sound filled with desperation and hope. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. His face was a mix of surprise and concern. But when his eyes landed on the frail puppy, his expression immediately softened with compassion. Without hesitation, he bent down and scooped Max up in his arms. Rushing inside, Freya could barely stay on her feet. But she knew in her heart that Max was finally safe. Inside the small cabin, the warmth was a sharp contrast to the icy cold outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow across the rustic walls. The man, whose name was Jack, hurriedly placed Max onto a warm blanket by the fire, his hands trembling as he checked the pup for signs of life, his eyes scanning for any injuries or distress. Freya stood silently in the doorway, her eyes never leaving Max as she watched Jack tend to him. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the exhaustion threatening to overtake her. But she couldn't leave, not now. She had brought Max this far, and she couldn't give up now. She needed to see him safe, to know that he would survive. The snowstorm showed no signs of letting up, and the surroundings seemed to grow even more desolate. The biting cold wind lashed at Freya's face, draining her of what little strength she had left. But still, each step she took was driven by an unshakable resolve. Max's mother was steadfast, even in the most desperate moments. Unwilling to give in, amid the freezing cold, Freya continued to walk in silence. She knew that her son couldn't hold on much longer. Max, her fragile pup, could no longer endure the snowstorm. Just days ago, he had been a healthy, lively pup with a shiny coat. But now, his body was weakening by the hour. Each step he took was unsteady, his tiny legs trembling as he struggled to keep up with his mother. Freya could hear his shallow breaths, and the exhaustion in his every movement. Max collapsed once more into a thick blanket of snow, his little body barely able to rise. "Max," Freya called softly, pausing immediately and turning back. She nudged him gently with her nose, trying to get him to stand, but Max could barely open his eyes, whimpering softly before collapsing again. His weak whimper pierced Freya's heart, each cry feeling like a knife to her chest. She glanced ahead, through the swirling snow, and saw a faint glimmer in the distance, a potential salvation for Max. It was a small light, but it was everything Freya needed right now. Freya suddenly stopped, raising her head to look at the light. Though her legs were trembling from exhaustion, she pushed herself to keep going, trying with all her might to take one more step. In her heart, there burned a strength without words, urging her through the storm. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, knowing that if she didn't keep moving, Max would have no chance. In the face of bone-chilling cold, Freya's legs grew weaker, each step more difficult than the last. But as she saw the distant cabin's light, something in her stirred. It was hope. The small cabin in the distance represented warmth, life, and salvation. She kept moving with everything she had left, her body shaking from the cold as she neared the cabin. Her legs finally gave way beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, breath ragged, but she had made it. Freya laid Max gently on the porch and sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the door, her whole body trembling with fatigue. She whined softly, a weak sound filled with desperation and hope. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. His face showed a mixture of surprise and concern. But when his eyes landed on the frail puppy, his expression immediately shifted to one of compassion. Without hesitation, he bent down and scooped Max up into his arms. Rushing inside, Freya stood silently in the snow, clutching her trembling body. She watched the warmth inside the cabin, where Max was being cared for. A sense of relief washed over Freya, something she hadn't felt in so long. Max would survive. She knew she had done everything she could to give him the chance to live. The warmth inside the cabin was a sharp contrast to the freezing cold outside. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Freya allowed herself to relax, even just for a moment. The crackling fire in the hearth filled the room with a comforting sound, its warmth wrapping around her like a blanket. She sat beside Max, who was lying on a thick, warm blanket near the fire, his small body trembling slightly as the heat slowly brought him back to life. Freya's eyes never left him. Her heart was still racing from the ordeal they had just endured. And the exhaustion was overwhelming. Jack, the man who had saved them, busied himself around the cabin. He worked quickly and efficiently, stoking the fire and ensuring the warmth of the room would last. Freya could hear him moving, but she was too consumed with worry to speak. She watched as Max's breathing gradually became less labored, his body slowly warming to the touch. It was a small victory, but it was enough to spark a flicker of hope in Freya's heart. Max was alive, Max was safe, but despite the relief she felt, a sinking feeling lingered in her chest. Freya had always been a strong, independent creature, accustomed to the harsh realities of the wild. She had spent her life fending for herself, learning how to survive, and she had done so with a quiet strength that few could understand. Yet, in this small cabin with Jack, she found herself overwhelmed by the vulnerability of the situation. The storm outside had been relentless, and she had fought through it with every ounce of energy she had left. But it felt like the storm was still raging inside her. The mother in her could feel the weight of what she had endured, and it was beginning to take a toll. Jack, noticing her exhaustion, turned toward her and spoke softly. "You did everything you could, Freya," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Max is going to be okay. Now, it's my turn." The words were comforting, but they didn't ease the weight that hung on her heart. Freya wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Max would pull through. But a mother's instinct never fully lets go of worry. She had failed once, she couldn't fail again. The thought of losing Max, of seeing him slip away from her grasp, was something Freya couldn't bear. Her eyes fell to Max, who was now breathing steadily, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically. But the sight of him lying so still, so fragile, reminded her just how close they had come to losing him. Her heart ached at the thought, and she couldn't stop herself from nudging Max with her nose, checking to make sure he was still breathing. As the hours passed, Jack continued to care for both Freya and Max, providing them with food and warmth, tending to their needs with gentle hands. Freya watched him carefully, grateful for his help, but there was a part of her that still couldn't fully relax. She had been through too much to let her guard down now. Every part of her, every fiber of her being, still felt like it was on high alert. The storm had not yet passed in her mind, and she knew that Max's survival was not guaranteed. Jack must have sensed her unease because he came over to her and sat beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. "You've done more for him than any mother could," he said softly. "You gave him the strength to keep fighting." Freya looked at him, her eyes tired but filled with something else, an unspoken gratitude. She had always been alone in the wild, always the protector, always the one who gave everything. But Jack's words reminded her of something she had forgotten. She didn't have to carry the weight alone anymore. For a brief moment, Freya allowed herself to lean into Jack's presence, closing her eyes as the exhaustion finally overcame her. But as her mind drifted into a light sleep, a new thought began to settle in her mind. The storm outside had passed, but her battle was far from over. Max had survived the night, but she knew they still had a long way to go. She had always been strong, but now, with Max's life on the line, Freya realized just how far her strength could stretch before it snapped. The weight of responsibility, of being the only one who could protect Max, was starting to feel unbearable. She had already pushed herself beyond her limits, and the fear of what might come next gnawed at her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. And yet, she couldn't stop, not when Max needed her, not when he was still so fragile, so small. Freya had given everything she had to get him here, to this cabin, to safety. She had nothing left to give, but she wouldn't, let him slip away now. As she gazed down at Max, still curled up on the blanket, a new surge of determination washed over her. This wasn't over. She wouldn't let it be over. She would see him through this, no matter the cost, and somehow, some way, she would find the strength to carry on. The days inside the cabin began to blend together, each one marked by a quiet rhythm of survival. The storm had finally subsided, but the world outside was still a harsh, frozen wasteland. Yet, inside the small cabin, the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of the crackling logs created a false sense of peace. Freya, though still exhausted, found herself able to breathe a little easier now. Max was showing signs of improvement, though his small body still trembled in the cold air of the cabin. But he was no longer gasping for breath, and that was enough for Freya to cling to, enough to keep going. She stayed close to Max, her eyes never leaving him. There was still a tension in the air, an unspoken worry that lingered in her chest. Freya had learned to survive alone, but here, with Max and Jack, the weight of being a mother was more profound than ever before. She had done everything she could to keep her son alive, but now, she found herself relying on someone else. Jack, a man she didn't know, who had taken them in without question and given them the warmth and care they so desperately needed. At first, Freya had kept her distance. She was used to living on her own, never needing anyone's help, but Jack was different. His quiet kindness, his steady hands, and the way he always seemed to know exactly what they needed, it wasn't something Freya had expected. Slowly, as the days passed, she began to notice the subtle ways he cared for them. He would bring fresh wood for the fire, make sure they had enough to eat, and check on Max when he thought she wasn't looking. His movements were deliberate, calm, and filled with a kind of care that Freya couldn't quite understand at first. One evening, after a long day of tending to the fire and making sure Max was warm, Jack sat down beside her. The room was dim, the only light coming from the fire. Freya sat with her head low, her body tired from the strain of the past few days. She was just beginning to relax when Jack's voice broke the silence. "He's doing better, you know," Jack said softly, his voice quiet but filled with a sense of reassurance. "Max is strong, he's going to make it." Freya nodded, her gaze still fixed on Max, who was resting peacefully on the blanket by the fire. She could feel the weight of Jack's words in her chest. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than worry. There was a small flicker of hope deep inside her. But it was fragile, like the delicate threads of a spider's web, barely holding together. I know, she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jack's gaze softened as he looked at her, his expression filled with a quiet understanding. You did everything you could, Freya. That's all anyone can do. Sometimes, we need a little help. But you did the hard part. You kept him alive. Freya's heart tightened at his words. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to her. She had spent her life fighting against the world, struggling to survive, to protect those she loved. And yet, here was Jack, acknowledging her strength without judgment, offering her something she hadn't realized she was missing: support. The silence between them stretched for a moment, both of them watching the fire as it flickered and crackled in the hearth. The room felt warmer now, not just from the fire, but from something else, something unspoken, a quiet connection that was beginning to form between them. As the days continued, Freya found herself slowly trusting Jack more. She started to let her guard down in small ways, allowing herself to rest when Max was asleep, letting Jack take over some of the responsibilities she had once shouldered alone. She watched him as he went about his tasks, chopping wood, preparing meals, cleaning up. His movements were steady, purposeful, and there was something about the way he cared for her and Max that made Freya feel safe in a way she had never felt before. One evening, as the sun began to set and the last rays of light filtered through the small cabin windows, Freya found herself sitting by the fire. Max curled up beside her. Jack was sitting nearby, his back resting against the wall, his eyes distant but thoughtful. Freya felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest as she watched him. There was something about Jack, something that made her feel like she didn't have to fight anymore. Something that made her believe, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, they could be okay. That perhaps, this small cabin, this unlikely trio, could become a family. Jack turned toward her, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the silence was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding. And then, Jack spoke, his voice soft but sincere. You don't have to do it all on your own anymore, Freya, he said. You've done enough. It's my turn now. Freya's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never realized how badly she had longed for someone to say that, to hear those words from someone who genuinely cared. She had always been alone, always the protector, always the one who did the hard work, who carried the burden. But now, for the first time, someone else was offering to share that weight with her. Max stirred beside her, lifting his head as if sensing the change in the air. Freya reached down, gently petting him, her fingers brushing against his soft fur. Jack's gaze shifted to the pup, and a small smile tugged at his lips. He's a fighter, just like you, Jack said, his voice full of admiration. He's lucky to have you. Freya looked at him, her eyes softening, the weight in her chest finally easing. No, Jack, she said quietly, we're both lucky. And in that moment, Freya realized that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. She wasn't carrying the burden of the world on her shoulders anymore. She had Jack, and she had Max. They had become a family in the quietest, most unexpected way, and that was more than she could have ever hoped for. The days had become a blend of relief and tension. Max's condition had improved, but he was still fragile, his tiny body slowly recovering from the ravages of the storm and the illness that had nearly claimed him. Freya stayed close to him, her protective instincts never allowing her to stray far from his side. She watched every small change in him, each breath, each twitch of his ears, and each beat of his heart. Her every waking moment was dedicated to ensuring his survival. And even in the relative safety of the cabin, she never allowed herself to truly rest. Jack, though kind and steady, could see the toll it was taking on Freya. She was a mother, a fierce protector, and her role as Max's guardian was the most important thing in her life. But he knew that even the strongest of hearts had their limits. Freya had given everything she had to save Max, and now it was becoming clear that the weight of that responsibility was starting to break her down. One evening, as the last of the day's light began to fade, Freya sat beside Max, her head resting against the edge of the blanket where he lay. The warmth of the fire flickered gently in the background, But she couldn't escape the quiet, persistent worry that tugged at her heart. Max had been so weak for so long, and even though he was showing signs of improvement, Freya still feared the worst. Jack, who had been tending to the fire, noticed the way Freya's shoulders slumped as she sat beside Max. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her eyes barely stayed open as she watched over her son. It was clear to him that Freya was wearing herself thin, her strength was formidable. But it was also being tested in ways that no one, not even she, could have anticipated. "Freya," Jack said gently, breaking the silence, "you've done so much for him. You've brought him back from the brink. But you don't have to carry all this on your own. It's okay to take a step back. Let me help." Freya didn't respond immediately. She just stared at Max, her gaze unwavering, as if the mere act of looking at him could keep him safe. The words Jack had spoken lingered in the air, but they didn't ease the storm inside her. She had always been alone in her fight for survival. She had always been the one who carried the weight, who did whatever was necessary to protect those she loved. And now, with Max's life in her hands, she wasn't sure she could trust anyone else to take over. "I can't," Freya murmured finally, her voice hoarse, as though she was speaking against a weight pressing down on her chest. "I can't rest until I know he's going to be okay. I'm all he has." Jack's gaze softened, his heart heavy with sympathy for the strong, proud mother before him. He had seen it before, in both animals and humans, the weight of a mother's love, the fierce determination to protect at all costs. But Jack also knew that sometimes, even the most unyielding of hearts needed help. "You're not alone, Freya," Jack said softly, kneeling down beside her. "You have me. I won't let you bear this alone. Max is going to be fine. And you need to rest. For both of you." Freya closed her eyes for a moment, the words settling into her bones like a bomb she hadn't known she needed. But there was still a stubbornness in her, a deep-seated refusal to let go of her role as the sole protector. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if she believed that if she didn't keep fighting, if she didn't stay vigilant, everything would fall apart. Max stirred in his sleep, a soft whimper escaping his tiny mouth. Freya's eyes snapped open, her body reacting instinctively, her heart skipping a beat. She reached down and gently nudged Max with her nose, comforting him with a low, soothing whine. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to remind her of the depth of her love for him. The weight of that love was both a blessing and a burden. It made her strong, but it also left her vulnerable. Jack watched as Freya carefully adjusted Max's blanket, her hands moving with tender care. It was clear that she loved her son more than anything in the world. But Jack also saw the toll it was taking on her, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to sag under the invisible weight she was carrying. She had given everything to keep Max alive, but now, the fear of losing him was something she couldn't escape. Without a word, Jack moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Freya's shoulder. "You don't have to do everything alone," he repeated softly. "I'm here. I want to help." Freya turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time with an openness that took her by surprise. She had never let anyone in before, not in this way. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the cabin and the soft glow of the fire, something inside her shifted. It wasn't that she wanted to give up or surrender her role as Max's protector. But maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to lean on Jack, just a little. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to do this alone anymore." Jack gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to. You've done enough. Now, let me help." For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Freya allowed herself to rest. Just for a moment, she leaned back against the wall, watching as Jack carefully checked on Max and continued tending to the fire. She felt a quiet sense of relief wash over her, relief in the knowledge that she didn't have to carry the weight alone anymore. Max was still fragile, still vulnerable, but Freya knew that with Jack's help, they would both have a fighting chance. The night stretched on, and though Freya remained vigilant, her body finally allowed itself a brief respite. She knew that the struggle wasn't over, that there were more challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Freya felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that, with time and care, Max would survive, and that she might just have the strength to see them both through this storm. The days passed quietly, each one marked by small victories, though the weight of what Freya and Max had endured still lingered in the air. Max was growing stronger, his breaths more even, his movements steadier. Freya watched every change in him, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and continued worry. She still hovered over him, her protective instincts sharp and unwavering. But there was a sense of calm now that had eluded her in the days following their arrival at the cabin. Jack had proven to be more than just a helper. In the beginning, Freya had seen him only as the man who had taken them in, a stranger whose kindness was a temporary necessity. But over the course of the last few weeks, her perspective had begun to shift. Jack's quiet presence had become a source of stability. His calm, thoughtful demeanor and gentle care for Max had begun to form a bond. Something unspoken but undeniable. And, for Freya, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the feelings that were beginning to grow within her. She had never allowed herself to form attachments. In her life before Max, she had been a solitary creature, content to exist on the outskirts of human society, trusting only in her own instincts and strength. But now, with Jack, something was different. She found herself noticing him more, his presence in the cabin, his movements, the way he spoke to her, and the way he looked after Max. There was a kindness in his actions that spoke to something deeper, something that stirred a long-forgotten part of her heart. One evening, as the light of the setting sun cast golden hues across the cabin, Freya found herself sitting by the fire, watching Max playfully nudge a small stick across the floor. Jack was beside her, carefully sharpening a piece of wood for the fire. His hands moved with ease, each stroke of the knife deliberate and steady. Freya's gaze lingered on him longer than she meant to, and a flutter of something unfamiliar stirred inside her, a warmth, a sense of comfort. Jack glanced up at her, catching her gaze for a brief moment. His expression was open, without hesitation. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you've been doing a great job with Max. He's a tough little guy, just like his mother." Freya blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. Her heart gave a small lurch at his words, a swell of emotion rising in her chest. She had always thought of herself as just a protector, nothing more. But in that moment, Jack saw something more in her. The simple acknowledgement of her effort, her love for Max, was a quiet, but powerful thing. She felt herself soften under his gaze. "I'm just doing what any mother would do," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But thank you." There was a pause, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Jack placed the knife down, his gaze never leaving hers. "Still, it's not easy, is it? Being the only one holding everything together. I see the weight you carry, Freya, and I see how hard you're trying. It matters." Freya turned her head away, a rush of warmth flooding her cheeks. She wasn't used to being seen. Not in this way, not with this kind of care. The world she had lived in had always been one of survival, of solitude. To be noticed for more than just her strength, her resilience, was unsettling. Yet, it felt strangely comforting, too. Jack stood up, brushing off his hands, and then stretched his back with a quiet grunt. "Come on," he said, his voice lighter now. "Let's get some fresh air. I think Max might need a walk before the sun goes down." Freya hesitated. A part of her wanted to remain in the cabin, to stay close to Max. But something in Jack's tone made her realize how long it had been since she had allowed herself to simply breathe. She stood, slowly at first, and then nodded. "All right." Together, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the sky had cleared, revealing a canvas of stars above them. Freya felt a momentary relief in the open sky, as though the vastness of the night could give her a moment of peace. Max trotted ahead of them, his energy renewed by the crisp air. Freya followed him, her thoughts swirling as she walked alongside Jack. The silence between them was comfortable, but not empty. There was an unspoken connection that had grown between them, something that neither of them had acknowledged out loud yet, but both could feel. As they walked, Jack spoke again, his voice low. "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens after Max gets better." His words were casual, but there was a weight to them, a kind of heaviness that Freya hadn't expected. "Why?" she asked, turning her head to look at him. "What do you mean?" Jack's gaze drifted over to her, a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Well, I know this cabin won't be big enough for long. The three of us, I mean, you, Max, and me. I want to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. I want to help, with everything. With you." Freya stopped walking, her heart pounding in her chest. His words hung in the air. And for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to speak. She hadn't expected him to say something like that, not so openly. Not so directly. She had spent so long thinking about her responsibilities, her fears, her love for Max. But this felt like a future she hadn't allowed herself to dream of. Not even for a second. I don't know what to say. Freya finally managed, her voice shaky. She turned away from him slightly, her chest tight with emotions she hadn't even realized were there. I never thought about what happens next. I was just focused on getting through the storm, on keeping Max safe. Jack moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to have all the answers now. We'll figure it out together. All I know is that you and Max have a place here. With me. Freya met his eyes again. And in that moment, she saw something in Jack that she hadn't fully recognized before: vulnerability. He wasn't just offering her help, he was offering her a partnership. A future. And, as unsettling as it felt, it was a future that made her heart flutter with something unfamiliar: hope. Max trotted back toward them, his tail wagging, pulling them both out of their moment of silence. Freya bent down to stroke his fur, her heart softening as the small, playful pup nuzzled against her hand. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Freya felt the weight of her solitude begin to lift. Jack's offer, his quiet insistence on being there for them, had begun to seep into her heart. And as the three of them stood there under the vast, starry sky, Freya realized that the future didn't have to be something she faced alone anymore. The days seemed to pass in a quiet blur after their heartfelt exchange. Max was growing stronger each day, and the tension that had once gripped Freya's heart began to loosen. If only slightly, the cabin had become more than just a place of survival, it was beginning to feel like home. In a way she hadn't allowed herself to believe in years. Jack's presence was a steady comfort, a reminder that maybe the life she had once known, the life of constant struggle and isolation, was no longer all that awaited her. But just as things seemed to be settling into some semblance of peace, something unexpected happened that would unravel the fragile sense of calm they had built. It began with the sound of barking, a sharp, unmistakable sound that came from the edge of the woods. Freya's head snapped up at the noise, her instincts immediately on high alert. She stood still, her eyes scanning the distance, her senses sharpened. The sound of a dog. Her heart skipped a beat. There was something familiar about the way it echoed through the trees. But it was a sound she couldn't quite place. Max, who had been playing by the fire, perked up at the sound, his small ears twitching. He had grown stronger, but still, his body was frail. Freya's protective instincts flared as she moved to shield him, stepping closer to Jack, who had already risen from his seat. Do you hear that? Freya asked, her voice tense. Jack nodded, his brow furrowed. Yeah, I hear it. Sounds like a dog, but it's strange. Not like any dog I've heard around here. Freya's heart raced. She knew that sound. The bark, it was too familiar. It was a bark from her past, from a life she had tried to leave behind. She couldn't explain why, but a deep, unsettling feeling crawled up her spine. Something wasn't right. I'll go check it out, Jack said, moving toward the door with purposeful strides. No, Freya responded sharply, her voice firm. I'll go. You stay with Max. Jack paused, his gaze softening. Freya. No, Jack. Freya cut him off. Her voice softened then, but the determination in her tone remained. I need to do this. I need to know what's out there. She didn't wait for his response. Freya stepped out into the cold, the sharp air biting at her skin. Max stayed inside, his soft whimper echoing in the cabin. But Freya couldn't bring herself to look back. The sound of the barking grew louder as she moved toward the trees. Her senses heightened, her every step careful, deliberate. As she reached the edge of the forest, the wind cut through the trees, howling as if it too sensed the arrival of something unfamiliar. And then, through the snow and the mist, she saw him. It was a figure, tall, moving swiftly through the trees. At first, Freya couldn't make out his face, but the shape was unmistakable. A deep, heavy breath escaped her chest. Tom, she whispered, barely audible over the wind. Her heart hammered in her chest as the man stepped into view. There, standing in the snow, was Tom, the man who had once been a part of her life. The man who had disappeared without a trace, leaving Freya with nothing but memories of a broken past. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since that day. He looked different, older, wearier, but the unmistakable features, the way his eyes flickered with a hint of recognition, of regret, were the same. Tom was back, and Freya's world, which had only just begun to settle, was suddenly thrown into chaos. Freya, his voice cracked, full of raw emotion. He stepped toward her, but she remained frozen, staring at him as if he were a ghost. Her heart twisted, but her mind raced with questions. What was he doing here? Why now? After all this time, why had he returned? I thought I lost you forever. Tom continued, his voice thick with guilt. I never meant to leave like that. I didn't know what to do. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. Freya took a step back. The shock of seeing him pulling at her. Her chest tightened. She had never expected to see him again. Not after everything that had happened. The pain of his departure was still fresh in her mind. A wound she had never allowed to heal. Protecting me? She said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You think leaving me was protecting me? After everything we went through, you just disappeared? Tom flinched, the weight of her words landing like a blow. His eyes dropped to the snow at his feet. Guilt consuming him. I know I can't take it back. But I'm here now. I want to make things right. Freya felt her emotions swirl, anger, hurt, confusion, until they settled into something deeper. The remnants of old feelings. Feelings she had buried long ago. Started to resurface. She couldn't just ignore him. She couldn't pretend that the past had never happened. Tom had been part of her life. He had once been someone she trusted. And now he was back. Asking for forgiveness. Asking for a chance. But Freya wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him. How could she? As she stood there, her thoughts racing, Max's voice suddenly cut through the tension. His soft whimpers echoing from the cabin. The reminder of the present. Of everything she had fought for. Brought Freya back to reality. She couldn't lose focus now. Not when she had Max to protect. Why now? She finally asked. Her voice steady but full of pain. Why come back now? After all this time? Tom looked at her, his eyes pleading. I couldn't live with myself anymore. Freya, I had to come back. For you. For Max. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it, but I need you to know I'm here now. I'm not leaving again. Freya's heart clenched at the words. The possibility of reopening old wounds frightening her. She felt torn between the life she had begun to build, the trust she had started to place in Jack, and the man who had once been her everything. I don't know what to do with this. Freya whispered, the cold air mixing with the heat of her conflicted emotions. She turned away from him, her mind reeling. She had to think. She had to decide. And in that moment, she knew her life was about to change again. The air in the cabin had changed since Tom's unexpected return. It was no longer just the soft rhythm of daily life that filled the space, now. There was an undercurrent of tension. A delicate silence that weighed heavy between Freya and Jack. Every glance between them seemed loaded. And Freya found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions she had been carefully keeping at bay for so long. She hadn't planned for Tom to return, let alone disrupt the fragile peace she had started to build with Jack. Yet here he was, asking for forgiveness, demanding answers, and most of all, making her question everything she had come to believe. Tom had stayed away from the cabin since their conversation in the snow, giving Freya space to think. He knew better than to push, and the quiet had returned to the cabin in his absence. Freya hadn't fully come to terms with what Tom's return meant for her. But she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. She had a responsibility to herself, to Max, and to Jack. She had to make a decision. Jack, as always, had been supportive without saying much. He had allowed Freya to navigate her emotions at her own pace, never once pressuring her to talk. Yet, Freya couldn't ignore the way his eyes followed her every move, the quiet questions that seemed to linger between them. He was waiting for her to make sense of it all, to find a way through the chaos that Tom's return had caused. Jack was patient, but Freya could see the weight of uncertainty in his eyes, too. He was just as unsure of what the future held as she was. One evening, as the soft glow of the fire filled the cabin and the wind howled outside, Freya found herself once again standing at the threshold of the door, her eyes looking out over the snow-covered landscape. The air felt charged, thick with something unspoken. She heard Jack's footsteps behind her and felt the warmth of his presence without needing to turn around. You're thinking about him again, aren't you? Jack's voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he didn't want to disturb the fragile peace that still lingered in the room. Freya didn't answer right away. She didn't know how to explain it. How could she? She hadn't even fully understood what was going on inside her own heart. "I don't know what to do with him, Jack," she finally said, her voice quiet but filled with a depth of uncertainty. "He's back, and it feels like everything I thought was in the past is rushing to the surface again. I don't know how to separate it all." Jack was quiet for a moment, and Freya could feel the weight of his presence behind her. Like a steady anchor. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "You've been through a lot. You don't have to carry the weight of the past by yourself. Whatever you choose, I'm here." His words were simple, but they held more than she expected. They were an invitation, an offering of trust, something Freya hadn't been able to give herself for a long time. She had been so used to carrying everything on her own. The idea of sharing her burdens, of leaning on someone else, still felt like an unfamiliar concept. But Jack's words resonated with something deep inside her, something that had longed for this kind of understanding but hadn't known how to ask for it. "I don't know if I can forgive him, Jack," she confessed, turning to face him. Her eyes searched his, looking for a sense of assurance, something that would give her the courage to face the past and what it might mean for her future. "I don't know if I can go back to that life. Not after everything we've been through." Jack stepped closer, his gaze soft yet resolute. "I'm not asking you to forgive him, Freya. I'm asking you to let yourself be at peace. You've already carried so much. And I think," he paused, as if choosing his next words carefully, "I think you deserve the chance to let go of some of that weight. For yourself." His words were a balm to the rawness inside her. It was as if the very act of sharing her struggle with him, of finally letting go of the solitary burden she had been carrying, made everything just a little bit lighter. She still didn't know what her heart wanted, what was best for her, or even what was best for Max. But Jack's support gave her space to breathe. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't standing alone in the storm. She had someone beside her, someone who didn't ask for anything but her trust. "You've been more than I ever expected, Jack," Freya said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his for the reassurance she hadn't known she needed. "I never thought I could let someone in. But you." She paused, her words trailing off as she realized just how much he had already come to mean to her. Jack's expression softened, and without a word, he reached out, his hand gently resting on hers. The simple gesture spoke volumes. It wasn't about promises or expectations, it was about trust. In that moment, Freya realized that, despite the complexities of the past and the uncertainty that still loomed, she wasn't alone. She had the strength to move forward. But with Jack's presence, she didn't have to do it on her own. For the first time, she allowed herself to step into the unknown. She didn't know what her future would look like with Tom back in her life, or how her relationship with Jack would evolve. But she knew she had a chance to heal, to rebuild, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for something she had never truly allowed herself to imagine: peace. Max, who had been quietly watching them from the corner of the room, trotted over, his tiny paws padding softly across the wooden floor. Freya knelt down to greet him, her heart swelling as she scooped him into her arms. Jack stepped closer, his eyes softening as he watched her interact with the pup. "We'll figure it out," Jack said quietly, his words a promise. Freya looked at him, her heart full as she held Max in her arms. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of hope. And that, for now, was enough. The days following their quiet conversation were a turning point for Freya. As the wind howled outside and the storm seemed to dissipate into the distance, the cabin itself felt more like a sanctuary. The warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of Jack's movements, and the gentle sounds of Max playing in the corner all seemed to fill the space with a sense of calm that had been foreign to Freya for so long. For the first time since she had arrived here, she allowed herself to truly feel safe. The weight of the past was still there, lingering in the corners of her heart, but it no longer controlled her every breath. She had begun to heal, slowly but surely. Max, too, was healing. He had grown stronger each day, his once fragile body now full of energy as he scampered around the cabin, his tail wagging in excitement. The fear that had once gripped Freya's heart at the thought of losing him had faded. replaced by the steady certainty that he would be okay. He was growing, thriving, and it was all thanks to the care they had both received from Jack. Freya had begun to see Jack in a different light, too, not just as a man who had helped her through a difficult time, but as someone who had offered her the very thing she never thought she could have again, peace. With him, she no longer had to constantly worry about survival. She no longer had to be the lone protector, the one who always carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jack's presence was a quiet reassurance, a gentle reminder that she could allow herself to rest, to heal, and, most importantly, to hope. But even as the days grew quieter and the harshness of the world outside seemed to fade, there was still one question that Freya had to confront, the one about her past. About Tom. His return had shaken her to the core. But now, with Max growing stronger and her bond with Jack deepening, she knew she had to make a decision. Could she truly let go of the anger and hurt that Tom's absence had caused? Could she accept his return into her life? Or would the ghosts of the past always haunt her? One evening, as the last light of the day faded into the quiet of the night, Freya found herself once again by the window, staring out at the forest. Jack had gone out to gather firewood, and Max had curled up on his blanket, exhausted from a long day of playing. Freya's mind wandered, her thoughts drifting back to the conversation she had with Tom all those days ago. He had left her once. He had abandoned her when she needed him the most. But could she allow herself to hold on to that anger forever? The sound of the door creaking open pulled her out of her thoughts. Jack had returned, carrying a bundle of firewood in his arms. He placed it carefully by the hearth, then turned to Freya, his eyes searching hers with an understanding that had become familiar to her. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low, gentle. It was a question that had become a familiar refrain between them, one that was always asked with care, but never with pressure. Freya took a deep breath, turning to face him. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her thoughts swirled, the weight of the past pressing down on her. But something inside her shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't have to face this alone. With Jack, she had found a place of trust, a place of healing. She could share this burden, too. "I've been thinking about Tom," Freya said, her voice steady but quiet. "About what he said when he came back. I don't know if I can forgive him, Jack, but I'm realizing that maybe it's not about forgiving him. Maybe it's about forgiving myself." Jack stepped forward, his expression softening. "Forgiving yourself?" he echoed, as though the words were unfamiliar to him, too. "Freya, you've already done so much. You've carried so much. You've fought for Max, fought for yourself, but you don't have to keep fighting alone anymore." Freya nodded, her eyes locking with his. "I know. I'm starting to see that. I've spent so much of my life fighting, trying to survive. I didn't realize how much I needed peace, Jack, and I didn't realize that it was something I could allow myself to have." The words felt like a release, a weight lifting off her chest that she hadn't even known was there. For the first time, Freya allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been missing, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection. She had spent so long focusing on survival that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live, to truly feel safe. With Jack, she could let go of the constant fear, the constant worry. She could allow herself to heal. "Tom, I don't know what to do with him," Freya continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still angry, still hurt, but I don't want that anger to keep me from moving forward. I don't want it to keep me from having a life with you. With Max, I've lost so much already. I don't want to lose more." Jack moved closer, reaching out to take her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than Freya could put into words. "You don't have to lose anything else," Jack said softly, his voice warm with sincerity. "You don't have to hold on to that pain anymore. You've done enough, and now it's time to let go." Freya felt tears welling in her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of release. For the first time in so long, she felt like she could breathe again. Truly breathe. She wasn't alone, and she didn't have to carry everything by herself. In the quiet of the cabin, with Max sleeping peacefully beside them and the fire casting a gentle glow, Freya realized that healing wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about allowing herself to trust again, to open her heart to the possibility of happiness, and to believe that the future could be different from the past. "I think I'm ready," Freya whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Ready for what?" Jack asked, his eyes soft and full of understanding. Ready to move forward, she said, her heart full of hope. Ready to heal, and ready to hope again. Jack smiled, his hand still holding hers. Then let's do it together. And in that moment, Freya knew that the future, whatever it may hold, was no longer something to fear. It was a future filled with possibility, with healing, and, most of all, with hope.